World War One, the nature of it at least, was, in the words of one British historian, a bloody mess. I just made that up actually, but I think any British historian would agree that this was a bloody mess. This was a war with new toys, one of defense in which devastating weapons like tanks, flamethrowers, machine guns are going to be used for the first time in a conflict that had been brewing for 1,000 years in Europe, and it's going to spill over into the world and set up future conflicts for the 20th century. We're still paying for some of the things that happened during this war. I would also like to note that this is a very popular, romanticized war. Hollywood still makes movies about it. People still write about it. It was romanticized at the time it happened too. I think the propaganda that was created, the machine, worked really, really well. As a result, we don't have the stories of a lot of people. It's so focused on those soldiers who served as, just human fodder that we don't have the stories about the African troops that showed up on the front, must have been looking at these Europeans thinking, what are you doing? Why are you digging? I don't know. This is just a mess of a war. It's important to remember that part of the story hasn't even been told yet. In the early part of the war, there was some mobility. The Chiefland Plan called for quick movement on the German forces. They were going to go through Belgium, attack France, take Paris within 6 weeks. What made this fail partly was due to Belgian forts that stopped it and slowed the German offensive. The Russians actually mobilized quicker than the Germans expected, so they had to split their army. But they weren't the only ones to fail. The French attack in Alsace-Lorraine also failed. So as a result, both sides are going to dig in, and this becomes a war of defense. Under these conditions, World War One turned into a defensive war of trenches, artillery, barbed wire, magazine rifles, and machine guns. They proved more effective than the old type of warfare that revolved around artillery, rifle, and cavalry. These unsupported attacks were now suicidal. The Germans also had a problem in that the entire front was on Allied territory. Also, no surprise attack could endure or even be successful. This turned this into a war of attrition where each side directed, their war, all of their output, everything towards winning this war. It created what we call a total war. The French war effort was undermined by the loss of its industrial output. In Germany, the British naval blockade worked really well. Both sides resorted to attacks using greater and greater resources of manpower, and these men just died. As a result, by 1917, some improved defenses helped, like the Hindenburg Line, but we're not seeing any kind of movement or change. Some new allies enter in 1915 as well, but again, both sides are dug in, and both sides do not want to negotiate or end the war. The concept of total war in the 20th century is used to distinguish between that and the wars that happened in the 17th and 18th, and even somewhat to the 19th century. Those were by rulers with small armies. They moved. The whole focus of most of those battles was to avoid battle. That changes in the 20th century. This is an all-encompassing war. It hit every nation. It was global in its character. It was severe. The casualties were massive. We're still dealing with some of the effects of this war. We see that this is not a war of rulers, but more a war of nations now. And so that kind of changes everything. Now, there is a differing perspective to the concept of total war. Nobody argues that this wasn't an all-encompassing war, right? But the argument is that warfare had been steadily increasing since the 1700s. That war had gotten worse and worse, and over time, it just got really bad. I don't know what Ian Beckett's ultimate argument would be, is that we're all going to destroy each other? Probably. Again, the war aims just show what a mess this war was. I could list all of them. I could go into Germans' war aims, proposed by Holvig in 1914. I know I'm not saying that right, but we'll all deal with it. I can go into French war aims, Russian war aims, British war aims, and my goodness, the U.S. war aims. There were 14 of them, by the way, as you know from your A-Push class. This was just a mess. I could do it all. I could talk about the Russian Revolution, the U.S. entry into the war and how that changed everything. What's important to know here is this. Wars should give their aims before wars start. They didn't do that this time, which shows a couple of things. First, it shows that governments were unprepared for this war. They weren't really ready for World War I or the severity or how big it was going to be. Also, especially by 1917, they had to justify this war to a traumatized population who was feeling this war badly. By 1917, people began to think of it as an irrational war. Also, they wanted to remove attention from all of this failure, especially from the European ruling class, whose sheer incompetence at a government and military level led to the disaster which was the Great War. So why was peace impossible in 1917? They came close. There was a new emperor of Austria named Karl. Such a great. His name's Karl, Archduke Karl. Oh my God. I don't want to talk about any of this, but I'm going to do this for you all. Okay, so ultimately, everybody wanted peace. Even the Pope was like, hey, come on, guys, quit fighting. Let's have peace. Peace was impossible. These countries, all of them, both sides, had sold this war to their population in such a really great way. The propaganda worked so well. They called for absolute destruction of the enemy, absolute victory. No one was willing to even come close. And it gets to the point at this time, especially, that there was almost a fear if they negotiated a peace. Their population, their civilians who had been whipped up into a frenzy already, would just go ahead and overthrow them. So we're going to see a lot of problems. I mean, that's what happened in Russia. In Russia, the war weariness is going to be the number one cause of revolution. It's going to allow for the communists to take over. And none of the others wanted that to happen. They really did fear that. So I would argue, I mean, my argument is that the propaganda worked too well and neither side was ready. By this time, even in Germany, you see the military become more powerful as a result of the Reichstag asking for negotiations. So in the final year at that beginning, early in that year, it's thought that the chances for Germany to win are really good. I mean, the Russian Revolution gave them their best chance for victory. And in December, Lenin's going to take over and negotiate with the Germans. That's in 1917, by the way, and announcing to the world that Russia was out of the war. So as a result, the Germans are going to push forward another offensive in March and July of 1918. We get some mobility finally. The Western Front is now new with, German troops. Now, they've been fighting on the Eastern Front, and we can't pretend that they were fresh troops arriving on the Western Front to help the Germans win. They must have been exhausted. I mean, that war was brutal. If the Western Front is one of digging, trench warfare was just one of massacre on the Eastern Front. So as a result, with this massive German push, they're going to have to move quickly because the U.S. is sending troops over. I think Germany underestimated the United States, and their ability to get troops over quickly. The Allies are going to respond by setting up a joint command under the French military leader, and troops are recalled from other areas to fight. By mid-July, the Allies were in a position to counterattack, and then the largest and the last battle happens at Amiens, using over 400 tanks to overwhelm the forward German divisions. Ludendorff was later to describe this as the blackest day of the German army in the history of the world. It put the decline of our fighting power beyond all doubt. Germany's going to ask for an armistice. They're hoping actually to play one side against the other. Their hopes will not be realized. So in September, the Ludendorff and Hindenburg conceded defeat and advised the Kaiser to form a parliamentary government. It was their hope to impress Wilson, honestly, and they thought if they had some democratic credentials, maybe the peace wouldn't be so bad. Maybe the negotiation could be even if it's a different government. So by October, the new German government asked Wilson for an immediate armistice. I mean, they're asking the United States, they're not asking their other enemies. Then similar requests come from Bulgaria, Austria, and Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, all which face defeat. As a result, they're going to be pretty rough on it. Germany's hopes of dividing its enemies were dashed when Wilson sided with the Allies and drafted a pretty rough armistice agreement. Events in Germany are going to take place really rapidly. I mean, once the news of this armistice breaks out, the German people are mad. They have suffered deprivation because of the Allied blockade. They thought that they were going to win. They had been told for years they were going to win. Just do without and you'll win. So as a result, I mean, even the sailors will mutiny. We'll see that more when we cover the rise of fascism. We're going to see how angry the military is. They're going to call this the stab in the back. The armistice agreement with Austria and Hungary was just as harsh. I mean, it's going to say, we're not even going to deal with you, the emperor, and he's going to lose his job, by the way. But we're not going to deal with you. We're going to deal with the independent people. We're going to deal with the Yugoslavs, and we're going to deal with the Czechs. We're not going to treat you like an empire. As for Turkey, they take over the Straits of Dardanelles, which leads into the Black Sea. This is a really, really important place. They dismantled the Turkish army, but, don't feel bad for Turkey. This is a revival for them, and they're going to do really well. In fact, all armies will be dismantled, and the Allies will be in complete control. So why did this last so long? Why did it take them so long to defeat Germany? Historians, especially post-revisionist historians, like to cover this. I mean, they're going to argue right away that part of the problem was this was a defensive, like all the new technology was defensive, and it created the type of warfare we're going to see. That the Allies benefited from a war of attrition. If they could just exhaust that industrial powerhouse of Germany, they would eventually win. Plus, you have the U.S. entering the war. Time did not, however, favor Germany with its two weak allies, Turkey and Austria. Turkey was having internal problems even before the war, and Austria was severely in decline. Out of desperation in January 1917, Germany tried to knock Britain out of the war by declaring the unrestricted submarine warfare on all merchant ships in the Allied waters. I mean, this is because that blockade that the British were doing on Germany was finally effective. I mean, that's the problem with the blockade, right? You have to wait for it to be effective. Actually, but this backfired because it affected the U.S. and it brought the U.S. into the war. Only in October, with the Bolshevik Revolution, was Germany at last able to concentrate forces on the Western Front. Ludendorff's offensive was a race against time before the Americans could mobilize their strength fully, but by July 1918, Germany had lost this race. Ultimately, Germany was defeated because it was locked into conflict with a coalition that it could not destroy. The war could not have lasted so long without the enormous industrial strength of Germany and the ingenuity of German scientists who were able to help lessen the impact of the British blockade. Munitions production was one of the great triumphs of the German war industry, and right up until October 1918, despite the Allied blockade, its army never wanted for munitions. Food, on the other hand, was a whole other case. But popular support for the war on both sides was also an important factor that prolonged the struggle. The war united whole populations behind their governments and generals. It inflamed nationalism and militarism and led to the belief that victory at all costs had to be achieved. In 1917, in their different ways, Generals Hindenburg, Ludendorff, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George inspired their compatriots to make an even greater sacrifices. In conclusion, in the end, I hope you do your own research on some of the casualties. We're talking millions and millions and millions. People still take travel tours to grave sites of the soldiers that died in World War I. Again, this is a romanticized war and only one side is being told. Certainly, that's an important type of history. We want to know about the military, we want to know about the soldier sacrifice, but we have to remember the sacrifice, the untold stories of women, children, colonized people, exploited people. Certainly, the colonies are going to suffer greatly. And what it's actually going to do is lead to the decline of class aristocracy and colonization. So that's a good factor. I think further research is needed on your part because I really don't want to go into what machine guns and flamethrowers do. I think that you can figure that out by a good game of Call of Duty and let's call it a day there. But I want you to remember that this war affects everything in the 20th century and everything we're going to learn further. It's going to affect politics in China, in Japan, the decolonization of Africa, the rise of fascism. Goodness, we're seeing the rise of fascism again, and things that are going on today are very much mimic the history of our past, and we need to be aware of that. That's my moralizing conclusion. Thank you.